I think it's a flaw that leads to a lot of tragedy, but I don't think it is his tragic flaw. I think a lot of people would probably find his situation just as difficult. So I think it's something that a lot of people could empathise with. So I don't think it's like an inherent badness or drawback of him, but it's something that if he could have got over it earlier, we'd have a much shorter play.
Yep.
Yeah.
No. He's a misunderstood, really generous. He's not evil at all. I think that he does what he acts upon within the play, but for all the right reasons, as I said before, because he feels that it's the right thing for the country and the right thing for the people. They like to holiday.
I suppose they're also like they're another part of Hamlet's life. So there's something that he also is kind of not of this world anymore, of this Denmark, and so they kind of are also slightly representative of that place, that European place in our version that he's come from, and so they're like another set of eyes in this world, another lens to see it through, like Horatio is as well. And so they're almost like another audience as we are, that they were seeing it through their eyes, and they're also having the challenge of which way to, like an audience, are going to be take their side or that side.
I think the hungrier you get, the better the accent. Like for example, because I find it very difficult to eat just before I do a play, because like unless you have something very very light, it sits in your belly and you can't really access your voice, or you can't move as freely or whatever. So I eat maybe like 3 or 4 or 5 hours before I even start the play. So in a play like Hamlet, where the first half is nearly 2 hours, by half time you're pretty hungry. So I used to like gobble down food in the interval. Mm. Yeah, we thought that art would be a useful tool through which his antic disposition could be expressed. So people often think about Hamlet as being this very intellectual, philosophical, kind of like quite bookish guy, and there's not much expression in that, whereas in art there can be a lot of expression and lots of expansion. And I really like the idea of throwing paint all over the stage, which had to be reined in several times. But yeah, the art is and also like for example with the painting, he writes Serpent King and he draws a snake, but you can just say it's quite good. It's kind of like satire. You can be like, oh, it's just art. Do you know what I mean? You can't get angry at someone for doing the painting, you know, or for doing the play or for writing the poem or whatever. But it can also quite subtly hint at your feelings about someone. So it was useful.
With Hamlet, I think the challenge overall is that it's such a well-known play. So there's lots of little key moments people remember, like Yorrick's skull or the closet scene with the pictures, and so it's like, well, how are we approaching that? Not necessarily how do we do it differently, or we have to, you know, just be different for the sake of being different, but there's lots of little key moments that people remember from previous productions. They go, oh, how are they going to do that? So that's kind of a challenge when you start working on a play that's so well known.
Absolutely. There is a genuine emotional connection, which we explored by, you know, doing work outside of what's directly said, the backstory, we kind of call that, and we invented their relationship, which was always appropriate. They did nothing while she was married to old Hamlet, my brother. I know he disagrees. Honestly, I'm telling him the truth, you know. But yeah, and therefore it's a genuine relationship based on mutual respect and also love of not only her but I think genuinely between the two of them, they love their country.
Yeah, I was. And I remember the first time we rehearsed the to be or not to be speech. I didn't even know we were going to do it. So it was, so you get given a call list of your rehearsal schedule, and I'd been called in to rehearse the nunnery scene, which is Hamlet and Ophelia. And to be or not to be happens to be like just before that scene. So we sat down, started talking about the nunnery scene, and then the director was like, okay, go on. Actually, no, we'll go from the start, the top of the scene. I'm like, what, from to be or not to be? And he's like, yeah. So like the first time you do it, you feel rubbish and you feel like you don't understand anything, and you're like, it's the most impenetrable bit of language ever. But you rehearse and rehearse and rehearse, and you eventually become more relaxed with it. More so than with any other character than I've played, because I'm controversial. I'm a bit skeptical about the whole idea of people becoming characters and not being able to like think as themselves or anything. I think there's always going to be an element, because I mean you're an actor playing a part, so I'm a bit skeptical about that, but that's just me. But more so than with any other character, with Hamlet I find myself getting lost in his thoughts and his actions and his journey, because it is so momentum bound that once you get on this kind of like freight train that is this guy's life, it's really difficult not to find yourself getting invested in it. And yeah, I'd find myself kind of like, I remember in the weeks just before we started, I'd be dreaming his lines all the time, like 24/7. This guy's, it was on my mind, you know. So I think any actor that plays that part will admit it's all encompassing, and you have to put 100% of yourself into it for you to even get under the first layer of the character. So, yeah. It's quite hard, because like, for me, like, all the scenes are pretty hard. I find them all quite difficult. And some of them are more, it kind of varies from night to night. One night, the nunnery scene will be really easy, but the closet scene will be really hard, and the next night it'll be completely the opposite. So yeah, they've all got their own virtues and their own potential traps, and it's about just trying to navigate your way through this 3-hour minefield without getting the leg blown off. But I usually find the final scene quite difficult, which is like a combination between the fact that there's a lot of things happening. You're nearly at the end, so you can see you can see the finish line, but it's quite important not to play the end before you get to the end. But when you're quite tired after doing 3 or maybe 6 hours of Shakespeare, it's sometimes you're like, oh, you can give into that temptation, so it's quite difficult to maintain that discipline, you know.
Yeah.
It sounds really weird, but like, because I mean, some people stay at home and they just like they record them and listen to them and when they fall asleep, listen to them or whatever. And like, I mean, everyone does it to an extent, but for me, lines only really properly go in when I start doing it. So when we start rehearsing scenes and we start thinking about what those lines mean and why we're saying those lines and what we're trying to do with those lines, that is actually what is my brain is logging. It's not logging the literal to be or not to be. I don't have like a script going through my subconscious going like that. I'm thinking about what do I want from this person. Okay, that makes that is the stimulus for me to say this next line. So that's how I learn.
If it was badly written, you wouldn't remember them. Yeah. It's so well written that, as Paapa was saying, that it's not about a line, it's about a thought, an idea, and you say one, and because it's so perfectly formed, then the next thought comes in and connects to that thought and the other and the other and the other. And it just is so fluid in his writing at times. And there are technical bits that you do have to sit down and go, right, I'm going to learn this bit. But I'm sure Paapa would agree that with something like To Be or Not To Be, once you start communicating that idea, it's such a fantastically deep and dense, but yet simple idea that you just, the words just come like they're your own. And yeah, that's how I learn them. There, as I said, there are elements that you might have to do a little bit more work, but mostly, you know, they're there. He's great for that.
I think, I guess the language is difficult to describe exactly what he is. But I think there's elements of both. There's definitely an assumed madness. He says that he's going to put on an antic disposition, and he very logically kind of puts forward that idea and does it and acts it. So it does definitely begin from that point, but I think he does spiral into a feeling and then atmosphere of franticness and volatility and rashness, which a lot of people could describe as a type of madness. But I think the one thing that is absolutely synonymous with him is a young man suffering from deep grief.
Yeah.
And the trauma and the shock that comes as a result of that.
My idea, Hamlet, is a young man and a student kind of still forming his identity and forming his idea of what the world is like, you know. So it's really useful for this play because there's a clear split in between the Hamlet that you don't see just before the start of the play and the Hamlet that you do see during the play. And there needs to be a big shift in between those two sides and facets of his character. So it's really useful to have that as something to build from to begin with.
I would describe Claudius as really, at heart, a genuine good man who has chosen to do the things that he does in this play for the right reasons, i.e. he does it because he believes it's the best thing to do for the country. And he feels that the old Hamlet, his brother, is basically like the old guard. It's like the old regime, old and traditional, whereas now they're moving into the 21st century rather than the 19th century. So he does what he does, as I said, because we need to bring our people, our country, into the modern age.
Those things come one on top of the other, you know. I think that's the thing. He gets overwhelmed by this huge seismic change in his world. So his dad dies, he has to come back to this country that he's kind of thinking about whether he wants to spend his future there or not. And then he sees his mum, and his mum is with his uncle, and there's a whole shady situation about how his dad has died and everything. So I think it's one bad is like when it rains it pours, you know, and like he's absolutely drenched. His antic disposition is a part of a plan in order to get some sort of definite answer. So he's seen his father's ghost, right? And his father's told him something very given him some very volatile information. That's not going to stand up in court, and that can't actually really properly stand up in the court of his own mind, his own brain. So he needs physical evidence, proof, in order to do that. The thing about the antic disposition is that it kind of gives you license to ask questions that you otherwise couldn't ask, or to do things that you otherwise couldn't do. No one suspects the mad guy, you know? So Claudius has already been like, oh, you're acting all unmanly because you're crying all the time, and why are you always wearing black and all this. So he's already, Claudius is already underestimating him. And I think the antic disposition only serves to further that in order for Hamlet to really be able to pierce Claudius and observe Claudius and push Claudius into a position where if he is guilty, that he'll be able to find that out. So when we were thinking about where we were going to set the production, there were actually a lot of different influences. What we tried to do from a very early stage is to create the Elsinore that we set our play in. And we allowed lots of different influences to create that world. So the influences from Ghana, influences from the Caribbean, European influences, Elizabethan influences. So we kind of created this kind of hodgepodge of, hot pot of lots of different cultures. And I went to Ghana for Christmas just before we started rehearsals, and I was asking loads of questions and asking what people thought about the play and ghosts and all that kind of stuff. And it's so interesting when you talk about how palpable the connection to the supernatural is when you leave Europe, you know, or when you leave our kind of idea of our society. When we talk about ghosts, we think about Goosebumps or like really, really dodgy like hidden camera shows, you know, but like in other parts of the country it's a real thing, and it has to be like that in this play. You have to, Hamlet believes that he's seen the father as ghost. So what happens, he goes on the battlements and he talks to Horatio and Bernardo and Marcellus, and they say, I saw your father's ghost last night. He doesn't say, what, really? Did you? No, you didn't. He just says, where? We wanted to create a world that was recognizable and a world that people could relate to, and something that was a Hamlet for our times, for now, you know? So there's a bit where like I walk out wearing like Air Max 90s because that's what he would wear nowadays. And like I just think that's useful. It's a useful tip of the hat to make people realize that this is a story that is timeless and a story that is universal, and it doesn't have to be a 1600s kind of like doublet and hose thing. It's something that we still go through. We still go through jealousy, we still go through love, we still go through death, we still go through grief. These are things that everyone can relate to, and that's what's so brilliant about that story. So that's why it was a really important production for me to be a part of, because I think that it's important that people know about that. Let me just explain the kind of setup to the nunnery scene. So, I mean, we have a very, me and Ophelia, or me and Natalie, thought it was useful for us to begin with a very, very close and loving relationship. And then, in the scenes before the nunnery scene, there's a scene with Ophelia and her dad, when her dad comes and says to her, you've got to break up with Hamlet, you've got to break up with him. And she says, yeah. So she comes, bearing in mind my dad's just died and my mum's just married my uncle, so I'm already in the slightly, like, not the most calm of states. She comes and says, oh, sorry, I'm breaking up with you as well. So it's one thing upon the other. So that in itself is a betrayal, but in the nunnery scene, it starts off as a breakup scene. She comes and she's like, here's all your stuff, can you just take it back? And I'm like, oh, but I did love you once. And she was like, you made me believe so. And I was, oh, no, I didn't love you. So, I mean, it's a bit of a petulant argument. But then there was a very, very important moment in the middle of the scene where something happens behind an arras, right? And Hamlet realizes that there's someone else in this room, all right? It's not just Ophelia. So he puts two and two together and realizes that Ophelia must be in cahoots, or must be as have agency as part of a bigger plan involving other people, be it Polonius, be it Claudius, and that is the biggest betrayal that he can imagine. The one person or two people, her and Horatio, but one of the only people that he thought that he could trust till the day he died is actually on the other team. No, and like that is a betrayal that I think he finds very, very difficult to digest quickly, which is why it kind of explodes in this quite aggressive scene. The play within the play is performed, and Claudius reacts in a very quite obvious way to being presented with this mirror image of what actually happened in terms of the murder, which Hamlet says, okay, cool, that's proof, so now I can kill him. And then he gets into a point where he's got a gun in his hand, right? And he's got the opportunity to kill Claudius. He's there, he's praying, he can't see him. But then he's about to do it, and he thinks, right, actually, he's praying, so if I kill him now, he'll go straight to heaven, and he'll live forever in bliss. Whereas my dad is still in hell, burning, because he didn't get a chance to pray before he was murdered. And there's a line that's actually been cut from our version. in a speech where he says, "This is not revenge, but this is higher in salary," you know. So Hamlet wants it to happen in the perfect way for it to be an eye for an eye. So he doesn't want Claudius to be killed and go to heaven. He wants him to go to hell, where he belongs. So that's another reason why you could call it indecision, but I think he's more just trying to get the job done in the right way. We talk about his antic disposition and his madness, right? I don't think Hamlet is mad. I think he's someone who's displaying symptoms of deep, deep grief and kind of post-traumatic shock as a result of that. But he's also getting into this real franticness. So the antic disposition kind of melts into this real kind of like high energy, high intensity, very, very reactive and volatile man. And so he sees something going on behind the arras, bang, shoots it. It turns out it wasn't Claudius, it was his girlfriend's dad. I'll deal with that later, go straight back onto his mother and really, really hammering that point home. So I think he feels like he's working at a very high intensity and everything is high stakes. There is remorse for what he's done, and hopefully you see that towards the end of the scene where he says, "I'll bury him and I will repent for what I've done, I'll own up to it." And when he sees the impact of what that does to Laertes and to Ophelia later on in the play, it really, really does affect him. But at this particular point in the play, I think his mind is so hell-bent on getting the job done that he hasn't got time to digest that action, even though it's huge.
Well, I say, well, it could have been me if I was there. I think at that point he realizes that he's going to have to kill Hamlet, because otherwise Hamlet will kill him. But more importantly, even if he doesn't physically kill him, he will be killed by reputation. He'll be killed because he will be discovered.
We came up with the idea that Yorick was the equivalent of like his nanny, his male nanny or whatever, but like the guy who, as he was growing up, was always there, like best friend in the world. And so the idea of seeing the skull of someone that you loved is a really, really kind of like mind-bending thing, but it kind of really, really makes him address full-on the hugeness of death and mortality, and almost like the futility of a lot of the things that we do. And he says, "Where are your jokes now? Who are you making laugh now?" And then he says, "Do you think a man as great as Alexander the Great looks just like this when they're dead?" And Horatio says, "Yeah." He says, to what base uses we must return, Horatio." So that's a really, really kind of beautiful moment. But then you have the duel, or in our version, the stick fight, where so-and-so tries to poison so-and-so, and like someone's got, anyway, it turns into a bloodbath, and his mother gets killed as part of a plan that goes wrong. His mother gets poisoned, and the kind of gut-wrenching reaction to that is what actually pushes him into a motion of action where he can actually finally do what he set out to do at the beginning of the play and kill the king, which he does. And then he dies.